Hello and welcome. Tonight we turn to a story that history books rarely linger on, a story hidden between the cracks of monuments and marble, a story of men who marched into battle for a country that did not yet see them as citizens, who wore the Union blue, carried rifles into fire, and gave their blood for freedom. And yet for too long, their names were forgotten. They were the black soldiers of the American Civil War, the men of the United States colored troops. This is not the tale of generals whose faces sit in stone. It is not the tale of politicians who signed their names in ink. It is the tale of men who carried liberty on their backs, men who came from chains, from plows, from the long shadow of slavery. And when war cracked the nation in two, they stepped forward. Tonight, let us walk their path. Let us wander into fields where grass still remembers the weight of marching boots. Let us hear the echoes of voices once hushed by history, voices that still rise if you know where to listen. The year is 1861. The land is quiet but tense. Virginia's rolling hills hum with the sound of cicadas. Georgia's plantations stand still, their fields heavy with cotton and sorrow. Wooden cabins hold stories too long unspoken. The rivers flow like veins through a body that does not yet know it is bleeding. America bends under the weight of its contradiction. A nation born on the promise of liberty, a nation shackled by the chains of slavery. The wind carries whispers of freedom, faint but growing. Like morning fog, thin at first, but spreading until it blankets the land. On these plantations, men push plows with broken hands. Women bend beneath baskets filled with harvests they will never own. Children stare at horizons they cannot reach, and yet beyond the fences, beyond the whip, a new horizon forms. A storm is coming, a storm of fire and steel. The Civil War begins not as their war, but it will become their proving ground. For in the struggle between North and South a question rises. Will the land of liberty finally hear the cries of those it bound in silence? When cannons roar at Fort Sumter, when smoke curls into the sky, enslaved men and women know what it means. They feel the tremor deep in their bones. Some flee at once, running through swamps, through forests, toward Union lines. They arrive with nothing but torn clothes and trembling hope. Soldiers call them contraband, not yet free but no longer enslaved. In those ragged camps by the rivers, freedom breathes for the first time. The grass whispers with memory, of men digging shallow graves in fields that once grew corn, of voices singing hymns beneath the moon, their songs both prayer and promise. They dream of a uniform, of a musket, of a chance to fight not just for a union but for their very souls. From South Carolina to Missouri, stories begin to flicker. A boatman named Robert Smalls seizes a Confederate vessel, sails it past watchful guns, and delivers it into Union hands. His courage spreads like wildfire, a message to all who still labor in chains. There is another path. In the North, debates rage. Some politicians fear arming black men. Others demand it. President Abraham Lincoln hesitates, cautious, calculating. He worries the border states may fall away. But the war drags on. Casualties rise. The Union needs men. And finally, with the stroke of a pen in 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation opens the door. Black men may enlist. Freedom has found a new weapon, the United States colored troops. The land stirs. From cabins, from cities, from the shadowed fields of slavery, men rise. Some walk miles barefoot to recruiting stations. Some carry scars on their backs as proof of what they've endured. They sign their names, some barely able to write, but determined. Their regiments are not named for states like their white counterparts. They are numbered, defined by their color. The 54th Massachusetts, the 1st South Carolina, the 5th U.S. Colored Infantry. Camp life is harsh. They drill until their muscles ache. Their pay is less than white soldiers. They are mocked, doubted, dismissed, yet still they endure. Because every step in formation, every click of the musket, is a step away from bondage. The grass whispers with anticipation, with boots striking soil in rhythm, with drums rolling in the distance, with hymns sung at night by campfires, men lifting their voices not in sorrow but in strength, and soon they march to battle. The nation stood split in two, a map carved by rivers and borders, but divided deeper still by the question of bondage. The stars and stripes still fluttered in the wind, but its promise was cracked. A land that had written liberty on parchment, and yet chained millions in fields. A republic that called itself free, while shackles clanged in every corner of its southern heart. This was the contradiction at the center of America. a dream spoken in declarations, a nightmare lived in cabins and plantations. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, it was not first declared as a war of emancipation. The Union called it a fight to preserve the nation, to mend what had been torn apart. And yet, for every enslaved man and woman, the cannon fire meant something more. Each volley of artillery at Sumter, each skirmish along the border was a signal that the world was shifting. The storm that had been whispered about in slave quarters and whispered in abolitionist halls was finally here. Plantations became uneasy kingdoms. Masters feared flight, rebellion, or the slow-burning resistance that slavery had always bred. Enslaved families carried rumors like embers. Some said Lincoln was setting them free. Some said the Yankees were marching to break their chains. Others doubted. But in every cabin, eyes turned northward. The contradiction grew sharper. White Union officers debated whether to return fugitives to their masters or treat them as free. The law called them property. Humanity called them men and women, and on the ground, choices had to be made. The first camps of fugitives were given a strange, cold name: contraband. Human beings described in the language of stolen goods. Contraband of war seized from the enemy. Yet even in the insult of the word was an opening. For to call them contraband was to say they could not be returned. They had crossed a line and stepped into another world, a world where freedom glimmered, fragile but alive. At Fortress Monroe in Virginia, the first great contraband camp grew like a city from the soil. Shacks rose from timber, tents from canvas. Families arrived daily, walking barefoot along roads, carrying children in their arms, leading the elderly on wagons. The air was thick with hunger, disease, and uncertainty. And yet it was thick with hope, too. No matter how thin the soup, no matter how ragged the clothes, every breath was free, every step was away from the whip. Union soldiers watched them arrive in waves. Some were sympathetic, some indifferent, some hostile, but none could deny the sheer determination that pushed these men, women, and children forward. They came carrying songs, stories, and scars. They came carrying the weight of generations. The promise of freedom had not yet been written into law. The Emancipation Proclamation loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, both promise and riddle. Lincoln, cautious and deliberate, waited for the right moment. He was a man pulled by tides. On one side, abolitionists pressing for bold action. On the other, border states threatening to abandon the Union. When the proclamation finally came on the first day of 1863, it did not free all. It declared freedom for those in rebellion, but left slavery untouched in loyal states. A strange, uneven promise, a document of both power and compromise. And yet for millions, its words were like thunder. However incomplete, however strategic, it opened the gates. Enslaved men fled by the thousands to Union lines, now not just contraband, but declared free. It was a riddle to some, but to those in the fields, it was a trumpet. Families whispered the words from cabin to cabin. Soldiers read them aloud in encampments. Ministers thundered them from pulpits. The chains had not all fallen, but the sound of their breaking was in the air. In the shadows of these early years stood men whose names deserved to be carried forward. Robert Smalls, born enslaved in South Carolina, worked as a pilot on the Confederate ship Planter. On a May morning in 1862, while white officers slept ashore, Smalls seized the wheel. With steady hands, he guided the vessel out of Charleston Harbor, past Confederate guns, and straight into the arms of the Union fleet. He carried with him not only his crew, but his wife and children. Smalls delivered the ship as a gift, and with it, a message: courage has no color. His act echoed across the North, proof that enslaved men could match skill and daring with the finest captains. Stories like his were not isolated, they were sparks. Men like Benjamin Singleton, who later became a leader of black migration, first tasted freedom by escaping into Union lines. Harriet Tubman, already a legend of the Underground Railroad, began working with Union scouts, guiding raids along southern rivers. Wherever the Union advanced, black men and women followed, ready not only to survive, but to fight. But the road was uneven. Contraband camps overflowed. Disease spread faster than supplies. Families who had risked everything now faced hunger and sickness in the shadow of their newfound liberty. Soldiers wrote of children with hollow eyes, of women begging for food. The promise of freedom was real, but it was fragile, tested by every cold night and empty belly. Still, the courage to keep moving forward did not falter. In those camps, schools began to appear. Northern teachers, many of them women, arrived with books and slates. They taught letters to men who had never before been allowed to hold them. They taught children who carried no surname but were eager to carve one of their own. The power of words, once forbidden, now became a weapon of freedom. Churches rose too, sometimes no more than a tent or a wooden shack. Hymns rolled into the night, sung with voices that trembled and soared. Preachers told their flocks that Exodus was near, that Pharaoh's days were numbered. Freedom was not just a hope, it was a faith. The nation itself trembled. Some white northerners bristled at the flood of freed people. Newspapers argued over whether they could serve in the army, whether they could fight as soldiers. Racism did not vanish with emancipation, it merely shifted its shape. Yet for those who had fled, the choice was clear. They had run to the Union, and now they demanded a chance to fight for it. The contradiction of liberty still lingered. A country that proclaimed all men equal, but paid its black soldiers less when they were finally allowed to enlist. A president who freed millions, yet hesitated to call them citizens, but the tide was turning. Every man and woman who stepped into those contraband camps, every child who learned to spell their name, every soldier who demanded a musket, pushed the nation closer to its reckoning. Robert Smalls would go on to sit in Congress, his daring escape a prelude to a life of service. But he was not alone. Thousands whose names never touched the pages of history left their mark in quieter ways. They built communities from the ashes. They planted churches that still stand. They raised children who carried the memory of bondage but walked into new worlds. The Civil War was America's crucible. And in its fire the voices of the forgotten rose. They came not as property, not as contraband, not as shadows in the ledger of history. They came as people, as families, as soldiers in waiting, and though the nation hesitated, though prejudice barred their way, they pressed forward. The grass of Virginia, the swamps of Mississippi, the plains of Tennessee all bore witness to this great movement of souls, a tide that no whip could stop, no law could bind. A tide that would roll on, shaping the course of the war and the course of the country itself. The nation was divided, but the people in chains had chosen their side. The war dragged on, and with every month, the toll grew heavier. At first, the Union fought only to mend a broken nation, to stitch the blue and the gray back into a single flag. But the deeper the fighting went, the clearer it became. This was not simply a struggle of borders and governments. It was a struggle over the meaning of freedom itself. And in that struggle, a new army was waiting to be born. At the start, black men were kept from the ranks. They were turned away from recruiting stations. They were told this was not their fight. Some generals sneered at the idea, claiming they lacked the courage or discipline for war. Politicians whispered of chaos, of insurrection, of border states that would crumble if enslaved men were armed. And so, for nearly 2 years, the Union fought with one hand tied behind its back, refusing the strength of those who wanted most to fight. But war is a teacher, and it teaches in blood. Battles dragged on and white regiments thinned, graves filled, hospitals overflowed. Families in the North wept as casualty lists stretched longer each week. The Union needed men desperately. And in the shadows of that need, the question returned, what of the millions still enslaved? What of the thousands who had already fled to Union lines? Could they not fight for the freedom they so clearly hungered for? Lincoln himself shifted like the tide. He began the war cautious, his words careful, his steps measured. He feared pushing too far, too fast. But as the war deepened, his heart turned. He saw the courage of fugitives who risked everything to reach the Union. He read letters from generals who admitted their campaigns would fail without black labor, and he heard the thunder of abolitionists who demanded more than preservation. They demanded transformation. By 1863, the decision could no longer be delayed. The Emancipation Proclamation did more than free those enslaved in rebelling states. It threw open the door for them to serve. For the first time, black men were called not just contraband, not just fugitives, but soldiers. And they answered. In waves they came. From cabins and cities, from cotton fields and fishing boats. They walked barefoot for miles to reach recruiting stations. They signed their names or pressed an X if letters were still new to them. They were farmers, preachers, laborers, fathers, sons. Some had escaped the lash only months before. Others had been free in the North for years. Now all were united by a single purpose, to wear the Union blue, to carry a musket, to fight not just for a country, but for their people. They were not organized by state pride as white regiments were. Their units bore no banners of Massachusetts or Ohio. Instead, they were given numbers and a title that told the truth of their existence. United States Colored Troops, USCT. The name was stark, but within it was a promise that they belonged not to one corner of the country, but to the nation itself. Among the first and most famous was the 54th Massachusetts. It was born in Boston, recruited by abolitionists, and filled with men who understood the weight of what they carried. Frederick Douglass himself urged his sons to enlist. He told them that liberty was not won by standing aside, but by stepping into the fire. 2 of his sons answered, marching with the 54th. The regiment was led by a young white officer, Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Born into privilege, raised in abolitionist circles, Shaw believed in their cause. He trained them hard, knowing the world doubted them, knowing that every eye would be upon their first battle. He told them discipline would be their shield, courage their weapon, because only by proving themselves could they silence the prejudice that surrounded them. Their test came on a July night in 1863 at Fort Wagner in South Carolina. The fort loomed like a beast at the edge of the sea, its walls bristling with cannon, its sand and earthworks thick with defenders. Union commanders chose the 54th to lead the assault. Some said it was bravery, some said it was sacrifice, but for the men of the 54th, it was destiny. They marched across the sand as twilight fell, waves crashing beside them, the stars beginning to glow above. Muskets fired, cannon roared, earth shook. Men fell, but still the line advanced. Colonel Shaw led from the front, his voice steady above the storm. He urged them on over ditches, through fire, toward the fort that seemed impossible to take. In the chaos, colors fell and rose again. The flag, battered by shot, was lifted high by Sergeant William H. Kearny. Shot through the leg, wounded in his body, he refused to let the banner touch the ground. With blood pouring, he crawled forward, planting the flag on the parapet. He shouted to his comrades, "Boys, the old flag never touched the ground!" His courage became legend, and years later, Kearny would be awarded the Medal of Honor, the first black soldier to receive it. The assault failed. The fort remained in Confederate hands. Shaw fell in the charge, buried by his enemies in a mass grave with his men. An insult that turned to honor. For Shaw had chosen to share their fate. He had led them as equals, and he would rest with them as equals. The 54th suffered heavy losses, nearly half their number killed, wounded, or captured. Yet in their sacrifice they shattered doubt. The world could no longer deny their courage. News of the battle spread like wildfire. Newspapers in the North wrote of their valor. Families in the South whispered of their defiance. The 54th had shown what thousands more would prove in battle after battle, that black soldiers were not only willing but able to fight and die for freedom. And so the floodgates opened. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 black men had served in the Union ranks, organized into more than 170 regiments. They stood guard on riverbanks, charged across fields, fought in sieges, marched in parades. Their muskets helped tip the balance of the war. Their presence turned the Union Army into something larger than it had been. It became not just an army of preservation, but an army of liberation. The birth of the United States colored troops was more than a military necessity. It was a rebirth of the nation itself. Each uniform stitched a thread into the fabric of America. Each musket carried was an answer to centuries of silence. Each battle fought was a declaration that liberty was not a gift to be given, but a right to be claimed. They endured more than the enemy's fire. They faced doubt from their own side, insults from comrades, pay that was less than white soldiers received. Some officers refused to lead them, some civilians spat at them as they marched. Yet still they stood in line, muskets at the ready, eyes fixed forward. And when the moment came, they fought with a fury born of generations. They fought with the memory of chains on their backs and whips on their flesh. They fought for sons and daughters still in bondage, for wives still laboring under cruel masters, for ancestors whose names had been lost to the auction block. Every step in Union Blue was a step toward reclaiming what had been denied. The story of their birth is not measured only in numbers. It is measured in men like Sergeant Kearny, bleeding but unyielding. In men like Colonel Shaw, who chose to live and die beside them. In men like Lewis Douglass, son of Frederick, who wrote letters home describing the pride of wearing a uniform and the terror of facing fire. These were the voices of the United States colored troops, voices that rose above the roar of cannons, voices that demanded to be heard. The grass of Fort Wagner still remembers their charge. The ocean still remembers the sound of muskets crackling in the night. The flag still remembers the grip of a wounded hand refusing to let it fall. These memories are stitched into the fabric of the nation, even if too often they were forgotten by the world. But the birth of the United States colored troops was no small chapter. It was the turning of the tide. It was the moment when liberty ceased to be a word on a page and became a living, breathing army. An army of men once enslaved, now soldiers. An army that carried not only rifles but the weight of a people's hope. And with every step, with every battle, with every life given, they proved a truth too long denied. That freedom was theirs by right, that courage knew no color, that history, though it may forget, cannot erase the fire they carried. The United States colored troops had been born, and nothing would ever be the same again. The drums beat steady, echoing across the camps. Men stood in line, muskets at their sides, uniforms stiff and new, their boots still unbroken. They had traded chains for rifles, cabins for tents, whips for the promise of freedom. And yet, even in their new blue coats, the old weight still pressed upon them. The paradox of service was clear. They marched as Union soldiers, sworn to the same flag, sworn to the same cause. But they were not treated as equals, not in their pay, not in their rations, not in the eyes of many who commanded them. They were free, yet not free. Soldiers, yet not fully recognized as such. Every stride they took carried both pride and burden. At first, their pay was set at $10 a month. White soldiers received $13. To some in Congress, this seemed natural. To the men in the ranks, it was an insult deeper than any wound. They had come from slavery, many of them with scars still fresh upon their backs. They had risked death not just from the enemy, but from their own former masters who vowed to show no mercy if captured. And now, after pledging their lives, they were told their labor, their blood, was worth less. The camps grew restless. Men spoke in low tones at night around fires that glowed like embers of long-suppressed anger. Some refused their pay altogether, saying they would not take a cent until it was equal. Others wrote letters home, bitter lines scratched onto paper, words of disappointment carried northward by couriers. They did not desert. They did not abandon their cause, but they carried the wound of injustice as heavily as any musket. Segregation ruled the camps. Black regiments drilled apart from white ones. They were given hand-me-down uniforms, worn boots, muskets that had already seen other battles. They ate last, sometimes less. They built roads and dug trenches, laboring as soldiers but still treated as laborers. And yet, when the call came to fight, they marched forward without hesitation. Every battle was not just against the Confederacy, but against doubt. They knew that the eyes of the nation were upon them. A single failure, a single retreat, could be twisted into proof that they were unfit. So they fought with a weight that no white regiment bore, the weight of an entire people's reputation. Courage was not enough. They had to prove courage twice over. Discipline was not enough. They had to show discipline beyond question. Every step, every charge was not just for victory in war, but for vindication in history. And among them rose a man whose name carried quietly but firmly across the years, Martin Robeson Delaney. Born in Virginia, he had known the sting of laws designed to crush ambition. He had studied medicine when black men were barred from classrooms, publishing works that demanded recognition of his people's dignity. Long before the war, he had stood alongside Frederick Douglass as a voice of abolition, writing words that spoke of self-reliance and pride. Delaney believed in the destiny of his people. He believed that black men must claim not just freedom, but leadership. And when the war raged, he pressed his case before President Lincoln himself. He told him plainly, "Black men will not only fight, they will lead." Lincoln listened. And in 1865, Delaney was commissioned as a major, the first black field officer in the history of the United States Army. In his uniform, he carried more than rank. He carried a symbol. To his men, his presence was proof that their struggle was not in vain, that in the face of prejudice, cracks were beginning to form, that even the highest office in the land could no longer ignore them. But the road to that moment was long and bitter. For every Delaney, there were thousands whose names were never spoken. Men who endured slurs from their own comrades, men who trained under officers who doubted them, men who marched into battle knowing that if captured, they would not be treated as prisoners of war, but executed or sold back into slavery. The Confederate government had sworn that black soldiers in Union blue would face death, not mercy. And so each step forward was an act of defiance, an act of faith. The prejudice was heavy, but so too was their endurance. They drilled in the rain, their boots sinking in the mud. They stood in the heat, sweat pouring down their backs as white officers demanded perfection. They carried logs for fortifications, built bridges across rivers, hauled cannons through swamps. They bore the labor that armies require and still demanded the chance to fight. And when that chance came, they proved themselves again and again. At Port Hudson, they charged into fire so fierce that even veteran regiments faltered. At Milliken's Bend, raw recruits with scarcely any training drove back hardened Confederate soldiers in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Every victory carved into the soil of those battlefields was also carved into the conscience of the nation. Still, injustice lingered. Months passed before Congress finally granted equal pay, and only after endless petitions, protests, and pressure from abolitionists. When the decision came, many of the soldiers refused back pay, saying they would accept nothing less than full justice. They had marched too far, bled too much to settle for half. Their endurance was quiet, but unbreakable. They bore the weight of history without knowing if it would ever honor them. They held the line, not just against the Confederacy, but against the doubts of their own countrymen. They lifted the flag, not knowing if that flag would ever fully embrace them. And yet, in their silence, in their discipline, in their sacrifice, they planted seeds. Seeds that would grow into a new vision of the nation. Seeds that would make the idea of liberty stretch closer to truth. Seeds that even generations later, through struggle and setback, would still push upward toward the light. Delaney once wrote that, "We must make ourselves a nation." His words spoke not only of politics, but of pride, of self-respect, of a determination to claim space in a land that had long denied it. His commission as a major was not the end of prejudice, but it was a signpost, a glimmer, proof that the sacrifices of thousands were bending the arc of the war, and with it, the arc of history. The paradox of service remained. Soldiers promised freedom, yet living in its shadow. Men hailed for courage in one breath, dismissed as inferior in the next, but still the drums beat, still the flags waved, still the march carried on. And in that march was a truth that could not be silenced. That freedom was not charity, that dignity was not a gift, that equality was not a favor to be bestowed, but a right to be claimed. The camps of the United States colored troops may have been divided, their pay shorted, their treatment unequal. But their service resounded far beyond those injustices. Their presence in the Union Army was a living contradiction, but also a living promise. A promise that though the road was long, though the cost was high, the dream of liberty was worth every step. And as the war raged on, the sound of their drums grew louder. A rhythm of glory struck against chains that had bound them. A rhythm of courage played against the prejudice that still lingered. A rhythm that echoed across the fields of battle, across the tents of weary soldiers, across the halls of power, the drums of glory, the chains of prejudice, both carried together, both borne with quiet endurance. And through it all, men like Martin Delaney stood as symbols, living proof that in the furnace of war, even the strongest chains could begin to break. Under the scorching June sun, the air along the Mississippi was heavy with heat and smoke. The river rolled on, wide and patient, carrying whispers of freedom in its current. It was a lifeline for the Union, a vein of power that cut through the heart of the Confederacy. And it was here, along its muddy banks, that some of the most forgotten battles of the Civil War unfolded. Battles not written in bold headlines or etched in marble, but battles where men who had once been enslaved stood against the impossible and refused to fall. Milliken's Bend, a name few remember. Yet in June of 1863, this place became a crucible. The Confederate Army, hardened and confident, marched against Union fortifications manned largely by the newly recruited black soldiers of the United States colored troops. These men were barely trained. Some had only held a musket for weeks, others were still learning how to stand in line, how to load, how to march. To their enemies, they were expected to crumble. To their doubters, they were expected to fail. But when the enemy advanced, when the gray uniforms came surging across the fields, the men at Milliken's Bend stood their ground. Muskets rattled, smoke stung their eyes, the clash became desperate. Many of the black soldiers had no time to reload. They dropped their rifles and fought hand to hand, bayonet against bayonet, musket butt against musket butt. The fields became chaos, a storm of screams and steel, yet against all odds, they did not break. With the aid of Union gunboats firing from the river, the Confederate wave was repelled. It was a victory that stunned even those who had doubted. Raw recruits, men dismissed as incapable, had stood against seasoned troops and held their ground. The cost was high. Bodies lay in the grass, blood soaked into the soil. But the courage shown there sent ripples across the Union. No longer could anyone claim that black soldiers would not fight. At Milliken's Bend, they proved not only that they could, but that they would, with a ferocity that shook the very foundations of the war. The Mississippi was more than water. It was a symbol. For centuries it had carried cotton, slaves, and the wealth of plantations. Now it became the artery of freedom. Each mile wrested from Confederate control by Union arms, and along its banks, the United States colored troops carved their place in history. They marched in the shadow of its waters, their sweat and blood mingling with its current. Among those who carried this struggle in his very name was Louis Douglas, the son of Frederick Douglass. His father's voice thundered in abolition halls, his pen scrawled arguments that pierced the conscience of the nation. But Louis sought to prove with action what his father declared with words. He served with the 54th Massachusetts, a regiment born of conviction commanded by men who understood that their sacrifice would be more than military. It would be symbolic. Every step they took, every bullet they fired was a declaration that black men were not merely property or contraband, but citizens willing to die for their nation. The 54th Massachusetts carried its reputation like a banner. At Fort Wagner, they stormed the walls in a charge that became legend. Colonel Robert Gould Shaw fell with his men, buried in a mass grave as the Confederates sought to dishonor him by laying his body with those of black soldiers. Yet that grave became a monument, a symbol of unity and death that the Confederacy could not erase. And in those moments, Louis Douglas, like so many others, fought not only for the Union but for vindication. He and his brothers in arms carried more than rifle. They carried the weight of generation. They fought with the knowledge that the world watched, that their bravery or failure would echo long beyond the war itself. At Port Hudson, at Petersburg, at dozens of skirmishes and charges too small to fill history books, the USCT bore their test. Again and again they were sent into the fiercest fire. Sometimes it was prejudice that placed them there, officers seeing them as expendable, fit to lead attacks where death was certain. Yet in each charge, they showed what resolve could do. They stormed trenches, they seized artillery, they planted the flag on ramparts torn by cannon shot. The Confederates feared them not only as enemies, but as symbols. For every black soldier who fought, thousands still enslaved might feel hope. And so when captured, the men of the USCT often faced a fate far crueler than white soldiers. Execution, re-enslavement, torture. At places like Fort Pillow, Confederate troops massacred surrendering black soldiers, refusing them the dignity of prisoners of war. And still, the men marched forward. Still, they fought. The courage of the USCT did not erase prejudice overnight. In Union camps, they were still often relegated to the hardest labor. They still faced the sneers of men in blue uniforms who saw them as lesser. But on the battlefield, their actions told a story no lie could erase. They fought with fire, with discipline, with sacrifice. And slowly, the nation began to take notice. Newspapers carried accounts of Milliken's Bend and Fort Wagner. And for many in the North, these stories sparked something unexpected: respect. The idea of citizenship, once reserved only for whites, began to stretch. Politicians debated, officers reconsidered, and in homes across the Union, families who had doubted began to say, perhaps for the first time, they have earned it. The fields where they fought were not quiet. They rang with cannon fire, musket volleys, and the cries of men falling. But beneath that thunder was another sound, the sound of a door creaking open. A door to freedom, to recognition, to the idea that the promise of America might one day belong to all who fought for it. When Louis Douglas shouldered his rifle, he carried not only his family's legacy, but the unspoken dreams of countless others. When the men at Milliken's Bend locked bayonets with Confederate soldiers, they carried the hopes of those still enslaved in cabins just miles away. When the 54th charged Fort Wagner, they carried the belief that even death could be victory, if it proved their worth. These fields of fire were more than battlegrounds. They were proving grounds. Every clash was a test not only of strength but of belonging. And as the smoke lifted over the Mississippi, over Charleston's beaches, over the scarred fields of Louisiana and Virginia, the truth became harder to deny. The United States colored troops were not a footnote. They were not an afterthought. They were the heart of a transformation. In their courage, the Union found new strength. In their sacrifice, the nation found new purpose. And though many of their names are forgotten, though their graves lie unmarked, the echoes of their muskets still roll across history's pages. For it was on those fields of fire, where bayonets clashed and flags fell and rose again, that freedom itself was tested. And it was in the hands of men once enslaved, men once dismissed, that the Union discovered a truth far stronger than prejudice. That liberty, when fought for by all, could never again be chained. The war is often remembered through the thunder of Gettysburg, the blood of Antietam, the long shadows cast by eastern battlefields that seem to hold the nation's gaze. Yet beyond those famous names, far from the marble statues and well-trodden fields, another story unfolded. In the swamps of Louisiana, in the hills of Tennessee, in the rivers that cut across Arkansas, black soldiers marched and fought with courage equal to any remembered today. Their battles were not sung in schoolbooks, their names not carved into monuments, but their sacrifice carved deeply into the soul of the war. The Western theater was vast. Its landscapes were rough, its battles scattered and brutal. Union commanders struggled to hold the Mississippi, to cut the Confederacy in two, to seize strongholds buried deep in enemy territory. And at the very heart of this struggle stood the United States colored troops. Men who had once been enslaved now carried rifles against the very system that had bound them. They did not fight in the spotlight of history. They fought in silence, in forgotten places, where victory still meant everything. The siege of Port Hudson was one of those places. It was 1863, the war balanced on a knife's edge. The Mississippi River was the great prize, a highway of supplies and power. If the Union controlled it from north to south, the Confederacy would be split in two. Vicksburg was the jewel of the river, but Port Hudson was its gatekeeper. Perched on bluffs above the water, Confederate cannon ruled the currents below, and so the Union gathered its strength, determined to take it. Among the regiments called to the siege were thousands of black soldiers. To many in the Union ranks, this was a test. Could they stand under fire? Could they fight against fortified positions? Could they prove their worth not in labor or marching, but in the crucible of direct assault? On May 27th, they were given their chance. As dawn broke, the fields outside Port Hudson lay heavy with mist. The air smelled of river water and earth. The Union Army prepared to storm the Confederate defenses. The signal came, and the men surged forward. Among them were the Louisiana Native Guards, composed of free men of color and formerly enslaved men alike. They advanced into a storm of musket fire and cannon bursts. The ground shook beneath their feet, the air split with death. At their head rode Captain André Caillou. He was a man whose story alone embodied the contradictions of the age. Born enslaved in Louisiana, he had won his freedom before the war and built a reputation as a leader in New Orleans. When the Union called for volunteers, Caillou answered. He became one of the first black officers commissioned in the Union Army, a symbol of pride for his men, a figure who carried their hopes upon his shoulders. As the assault began, the native guards charged through tangled underbrush and broken ground. Confederate guns tore into their ranks, mowing men down, scattering bodies across the field. Smoke swallowed the landscape, screams filled the air. Yet through it all, Caillou pressed forward. His horse carried him into the storm until it fell beneath him. Rising from the ground, he drew his sword and urged his men on. Witnesses would later say that even as the battlefield became chaos, Caillou's voice rang clear above the din. He shouted orders in French and English, rallying his troops, refusing to let them falter. Then, struck by a cannonball, his arm shattered, yet still he pressed on. Bloodied in agony, he would not retreat. He led again, sword in hand, until another round struck him down. He fell in glory before his men, refusing surrender, refusing retreat. For hours, his body lay on the field, untouchable under Confederate fire. His men wept, his enemies marveled, his courage burned into memory. The charge itself failed. The Union did not take Port Hudson that day. Hundreds of black soldiers lay dead or dying in the swamps and thickets, yet their valor broke the chains of doubt. Reports spread across the North. Newspapers carried stories of the bravery of the native guards. The death of André Caillou became a rallying cry. Abolitionists spoke his name, pointing to his sacrifice as proof that black soldiers deserved honor, equality, and recognition. For his men, his memory was eternal. They had seen him fall not as a slave, not as a question of worth, but as a soldier, a leader, an American. The siege dragged on for weeks, hunger and heat pressing against both armies. Black troops continued to fight, building trenches, enduring constant fire, charging again when called. And when at last Port Hudson fell in July, surrendering after Vicksburg had already collapsed upriver, the Mississippi River lay in Union hands. The Confederacy was cut in two, its lifeline severed, and woven into that victory was the courage of black men who had stormed the gates and proved themselves in blood. In Tennessee and Arkansas, too, their stories unfolded. At places like Fort Pillow, they would face unspeakable cruelty. At Helena, they held ground against overwhelming force. In skirmishes along riverbanks and forests, they fought not only for Union victory but for the very idea of their own humanity. The Western theater gave them fewer statues, fewer speeches, but the ground remembers. The river remembers. The fields where they stood still whisper their defiance. The story of Captain Kailua stands brightest among these forgotten heroes. His funeral in New Orleans was immense, a procession that drew crowds, a service that resounded with pride. His sacrifice, his very existence as a black officer leading men into battle, challenged the old world and lit a flame for the new. He had been born into bondage, denied education, denied freedom, and yet he rose to lead soldiers, to die a captain, to inspire a nation. And he was not alone. His men, whose names are too often lost, carried their muskets with equal courage. Men who had once been laborers in cane fields and cotton rows now bore bayonets against the entrenched might of the Confederacy. Their courage was no less fierce, their blood no less red. Each step they took forward into fire was a declaration that freedom was theirs to claim. The Western theater may not echo as loudly as Gettysburg or Antietam, but its lessons are no less powerful. Here, in forgotten swamps and small towns, black soldiers proved again and again that they were more than laborers, more than symbols, they were warriors. And in their sacrifice, the Union found strength it did not know it had. The siege lines of Port Hudson have long since faded. Grass covers the trenches, trees shade the bluffs. The Mississippi flows on, indifferent and eternal. Yet beneath that calm surface lies memory, the memory of men who marched into fire, of a captain who refused to retreat, of a people who claimed their place in history not with words, but with their lives. These are the forgotten heroes of the Western theater. Men who fought where the eyes of the world were not fixed, where history's pen hesitated, but where the struggle for freedom was as fierce as anywhere. Their voices are faint now, carried only in fragments, but if you stand by the river's edge, you might still hear them. In the rush of water, in the rustle of trees, in the silence of the fields where they fell, their courage whispers still. The night was the soldier's only gift. When the muskets were stacked and the drills were done, when the officers' commands fell silent and the smoke of the day drifted away, men gathered around campfires. The flames crackled low, shadows stretched long, and voices rose into the darkness. Songs carried across the fields like prayers with wings. Some were hymns remembered from cabins and churches, passed down from ancestors who had sung them under the weight of chains. Others were new, born from the march of boots and the thunder of drums, fashioned into marching songs that kept weary legs moving through mud and frost. The songs were more than sound. They were memory, hope, defiance. They turned sorrow into strength, fear into fire. Around the embers, men lifted their voices to chase back the loneliness. Some sang of Zion, a promised land beyond pain. Some sang of Jordan, a river that was freedom, where no master's whip could reach. The words carried the pulse of centuries, and now they became the heartbeat of the army itself. The white tents glowed like lanterns in the night, but it was the music that made the camp alive. Spirituals rose, sometimes soft as a lullaby, sometimes sharp as a cry to heaven. Steal away, go down, Moses. John Brown's body, each one braided faith and fire together. They sang to remind themselves who they were, who they had always been, and what they would become when the guns fell silent. And in the flicker of those fires, words were written too. Soldiers who had once been forbidden to read or write now pressed quills into paper. Their handwriting was often crooked, their spelling uncertain, but their voices rang clear. Letters carried across the miles became lifelines. Some wrote to wives left behind promising to return. Some wrote to children they had not seen in years. Others wrote to friends still in bondage, daring to send words of freedom into the darkness of slavery. Few letters survive, but those that do blaze like sparks through time. Spotswood Rice, a soldier in the Union ranks, had once been enslaved in Missouri. When he put his words to paper, it was not to his daughter, but to the man who still held her. His sentences were jagged, fierce, alive with the fury of a father whose blood now ran in Union blue. He told the enslaver that he would take his daughter back, not as a slave, but as his child, and that nothing on earth would stop him. His words burned with the power of a man who had found not only freedom, but a musket and a cause. Rice's letter was not polite. It was not meant to be. It was a declaration of war written in ink. He warned the enslaver that the day of judgment was at hand, that men once enslaved now carried rifles and wore the eagle on their button. He promised that his daughter would not remain in bondage, and if the man tried to hold her, he would feel the fury of a father who had suffered too long. Every line pulsed with defiance. with the unbreakable will of a man who had tasted liberty and would not rest until his family shared it. Around campfires, men shared such letters aloud, stumbling over the words, smiling at the thought of wives and children, frowning at the memory of loved ones still enslaved. For many, writing was new, but the emotions were ancient. Ink became another weapon, a way to strike at the silence, a way to send courage across the miles. Some letters were tender, carrying love wrapped in clumsy sentences. Others were fierce, like Rice's, sharpened into blades of language. All were pieces of the human soul written down, fragile, but enduring. The nights were cold, the ground was hard, but the songs and letters turned the darkness into a sanctuary. Some nights the soldiers laughed together, swapping stories of childhood, of cabins lit by candlelight, of stolen moments of joy. Other nights, grief hung heavy. They remembered brothers who had fallen, comrades buried far from home, families they might never see again. The songs then grew softer, like lullabies for the dead, like whispers sent heavenward. Music wove the men together. When they marched, it kept them in step. When they fought, it gave them courage. And when they rested, it soothed their wounds. The officers sometimes frowned at the endless singing, but they could not silence it. For the men, song was life. It was the one thing that slavery had never taken, the one inheritance that no whip or chain could erase. In the camps, younger soldiers learned old hymns from the elders. Voices cracked, but the melodies endured. A boy who had never learned his letters could still sing the lines that his grandmother had taught him. A man who had forgotten the face of his mother could still remember her voice in a hymn she once sang while bent over a field. Every note carried the weight of memory. Every chorus carried a people forward. And the letters, fragile though they were, became treasures. Some never reached their destination. Others were tucked into pockets, folded in Bibles, read and reread until the ink faded. But in every word was the heartbeat of men who were not only soldiers, but fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. They were fighting not for abstract ideals alone, but for families bound in chains, for children waiting in silence, for a world where their songs could be sung in freedom. Campfires glowing in the night, hymns weaving through the air, pens scratching across paper. These were the softer weapons of the war. They did not kill, but they sustained. They did not wound, but they healed. They gave men the strength to rise again at dawn, to march, to fight, to endure. And though the battles have long ended, the songs remain. Spirituals born in those camps carried forward into churches, into movements for justice, into the very soul of America's music. The letters, preserved by chance, still speak across the centuries, voices of men who had been silenced once but refused to be silenced again. Spotswood Rice's fury, his unshakable defiance, still burns on the page, proof that the pen can carry the same fire as the musket. So when we remember the war, we must also remember the nights. The quiet hours when songs rose like smoke and words were etched like prayers. For in those songs and letters lived the spirit of the United States colored troops, a spirit unbroken by war, unshaken by prejudice, unafraid of the dark. The war was not only fought with muskets and cannons. For the men of the United States colored troops, the price of freedom was counted in a darker coin. To serve meant to risk not only death on the battlefield, but something crueler that awaited if captured. For the Confederacy had sworn its hatred openly. They declared that black soldiers in Union blue were not men of war to be taken prisoner, but runaways to be punished, rebels to be destroyed. To wear the eagle on their buttons was to invite wrath, not mercy. And so for these men, survival itself was never guaranteed. White soldiers who fell into enemy hands might endure prison camps, starvation, disease, but they had at least the chance to live. For their black comrades, capture too often meant execution or re-enslavement. Theirs was a service steeped in risk beyond measure, courage tested not only in fire but in the shadow of a promise that if caught, there would be no quarter. This truth bled out most terribly at Fort Pillow, April 12, 1864. A small earthwork fort along the Mississippi, garrisoned by Union troops, many of them black soldiers from the newly formed USCT, alongside white Tennesseans who had turned against the Confederacy. The fort was commanded, the men weary but determined. Then came the gray tide, General Nathan Bedford Forrest and his cavalry descending with speed and fury. The defenders fought hard. Cannon fire roared from the parapets, musket smoke thickened the air. The battle raged until the walls were broken and the defenders overwhelmed. The white flag was raised, the signal of surrender. The guns should have fallen silent, but they did not. What followed was no battle. It was slaughter. Confederate soldiers surged into the fort, and instead of taking prisoners, they opened fire on men who had laid down arms. Black soldiers were gunned down where they stood. Others fled toward the riverbank, only to be cut down in the water. Some begged for mercy, wounded and unarmed, but the rifles answered with death. Witnesses would later call it a massacre, a stain on the honor of war itself. The ground at Fort Pillow was left littered with bodies, many shot after surrender, many mutilated. The news spread north like wildfire. Outrage thundered in newspapers, in speeches in the halls of Congress. Abolitionists cried out that this was the proof of the Confederacy's true nature, its hatred laid bare in blood. For the men of the USCT still in the field, the massacre was a warning etched in horror. They knew now that surrender was no refuge, that their only choices were victory or death. And yet, they continued to march, to fight, to carry the flag. One soldier who gave voice to this injustice was Private James Henry Gooding of the 54th Massachusetts. He was a man who had once been enslaved, who had bought his freedom, and who had taken up arms to prove that his life, his people's lives, were worth more than chains. Gooding was not only a soldier of battle but of words. He wrote letters clear and fierce to newspapers and to his family describing the life of a black soldier. His pen carried the same steady strength as his musket. In September of 1863, months before Fort Pillow, Gooding took the boldest step of all. He wrote directly to President Abraham Lincoln. His letter was not meek, not pleading, but proud, demanding. He spoke of the injustice of unequal pay, the insult of being valued less than white comrades. "Are we soldiers or are we laborers?" he asked. His words cut to the heart of the paradox that defined their service. They carried rifles, they charged into battle, they bled for the Union. And yet the government hesitated to treat them as equal. Gooding's letter reached Lincoln, and in time the pay was equalized. His courage in writing became part of the larger fight, proof that even in the midst of war, black soldiers would not be silent. They demanded not only freedom from slavery, but dignity, recognition, and justice. But even dignity could not shield them from the fury of their enemies. At Fort Pillow and at other smaller skirmishes lost to memory, Confederate wrath fell hardest on men whose only crime was wearing Union blue over black skin. Prison camps like Andersonville were nightmares for all who entered, but for captured USCT soldiers, the suffering was multiplied. Disease, hunger, beatings, and the ever-present threat of being sold back into bondage. To endure such risk and still march forward required a strength few can comprehend. And still, they fought. They did not lay down their arms. They did not turn away, even knowing the price, even seeing the graves of comrades who had fallen not in battle but in massacre. They stood their ground. To them, the risk was worth the promise. Every musket raised, every bayonet fixed, every step into enemy fire was a claim upon the future. They fought not only to end slavery, but to demand that America itself be reshaped by their blood. The massacre at Fort Pillow did not end the USCT. If anything, it steeled their resolve. They fought harder with the grim knowledge that surrender was not an option. They fought for themselves, for their families still in bondage, for the dignity denied them in life but promised in sacrifice. And as word of their courage spread, more men came to the recruiting stations, ready to take the risk, ready to bear the cost. James Henry Gooding would not live to see the war's end. Captured at the Battle of Olustee in Florida, he was sent to Andersonville, where disease and starvation claimed him in 1864. His body lay in the soil of Georgia, but his words endured. His letter to Lincoln remained, a voice that spoke for thousands who could not write, who could only carry their cause with rifle and song. The price of freedom was heavy. It was paid in massacres, in broken bodies, in graves far from home. It was paid in hunger and frost, in wounds left untreated, in the silence of families torn apart. But it was also paid in courage, in letters written boldly, in the defiance of men who stared hatred in the face and did not bow. To remember Fort Pillow is to remember the cost. To hear the words of James Henry Gooding is to remember the demand. Freedom was never given. It was claimed with ink and with blood, with voices and with lives. And though the ground at Fort Pillow lies quiet now, beneath its grass lies a story that cannot be silenced. The story of men who paid the highest price so that others might live free. The war stretched on, longer and bloodier than anyone had imagined. Every month brought new battles, new graves, new lists of names sent home in folded envelopes. And yet, within the Union Army itself, another struggle raged, a quieter, more insidious battle. It was not fought with muskets or cannon, but with prejudice and pride. It was the battle over whether black men in blue could ever truly be seen as soldiers. Some Union commanders never hid their contempt. To them, the United States colored troops were an experiment at best, a nuisance at worst. They scoffed at the thought of formerly enslaved men standing shoulder to shoulder with white soldiers. They muttered that the army should not be sullied, that these men should be used only for digging trenches, building fortifications, hauling supplies. In their minds, war was still the privilege of white men, while black men were meant only for labor, even under the flag of freedom. But the battlefield has a way of stripping illusions bare. At Milliken's Bend, at Port Hudson, at Fort Wagner, black regiments proved themselves in blood. They charged breastworks, they held lines, they fought with the ferocity of men who had everything to gain and nothing to lose. Still, for every victory there were commanders who refused to see. They wrote reports that downplayed the courage of their black troops or credited white officers while ignoring the men who had carried the day. Recognition was not easily given. And yet, in the silence of strategy rooms, in the grind of campaigns that wore down the Union Army, some commanders began to understand. Numbers mattered, endurance mattered, and the United States colored troops were no small experiment. They were an army within an army. By the war's end, nearly 180,000 black men had answered the call. Without them, the Union strength would have faltered. Even the most reluctant generals could not deny the math written in blood. Among those who saw most clearly was Ulysses S. Grant. He was no fiery abolitionist. He was not a man given to lofty speeches or moral crusades, but Grant was a soldier above all else, and he measured men by results. He knew the truth few others would admit aloud. Without the USCT, the Union could not win this war. Grant wrote plainly that the arming of black troops was one of the gravest blows struck against the Confederacy. Every musket in their hands weakened the enemy twice, once by depriving the South of enslaved labor and again by turning that labor into Union power. Grant's recognition was quiet, but it was decisive. When he rose to command all Union armies, he did not strip black regiments of their place. He did not relegate them to ditches and picks. He let them march, fight, and bleed as soldiers. It was not equality in spirit, but it was acknowledgement in practice, and for the USCT that mattered. Not every general shared this pragmatism. Some, like William Tecumseh Sherman, were deeply skeptical. Sherman accepted black troops into his campaigns only because necessity forced his hand. He doubted their discipline, doubted their usefulness, even as they marched through the burning South beside his veterans. Sherman would never celebrate their courage in his memoirs, never give them the credit they earned with bayonets and boots. To him, they were tools, not brothers in arms. Others, however, came to admire the men they commanded. General Benjamin Butler, one of the earliest to accept escaped slaves into Union service, spoke openly of their determination. He had seen them fight at New Orleans, had watched them hold their ground where seasoned white regiments faltered. Butler recognized something deeper than numbers. He saw men fighting not only for a flag but for their very right to exist as free beings. To Butler, their fire was undeniable. This division among commanders mirrored the larger storm in Washington. Political debates raged as fiercely as any cannonade. In Congress, some argued that arming black men was dangerous, that it would provoke insurrection, that it violated the natural order. Others saw it as a weapon too powerful to ignore, a chance to strike at the Confederacy's foundation. Every speech echoed across battlefields where men's lives were the proof, where the United States colored troops made arguments with their blood that no senator could deny. And yet, even as black regiments turned the tide in critical moments, their victories were filtered through lenses clouded by prejudice. Reports to Washington often understated their heroism or buried their contributions beneath the achievements of white officers. Families of fallen black soldiers received letters that spoke of loss, but rarely of glory. The recognition that should have lifted their names into history instead left them buried in shadows. But the soldiers themselves knew the truth. Around campfires, they spoke of what they had done, of the ground they had held, of the flags they had carried through storms of iron. They wrote letters to wives and children describing battles where they had stood tall. Their stories were not always echoed by generals, but they were carried in the voices of those who lived them. And in time, those voices became the record that history could not erase. Grant's admission that the war could not be won without them was perhaps the clearest vindication. He did not cloak it in sentiment, did not veil it in flowery praise. He spoke as a soldier to soldiers. These men were essential. Their muskets, their bodies, their courage had become the hinge upon which victory swung. And though prejudice lingered, though blindness still clouded the eyes of many commanders, the reality was undeniable. The generals who would not see could not change the fact that the United States colored troops had already written themselves into the story of the war. They had already stood on ramparts, already spilled blood in cotton fields turned to killing grounds, already planted their flags where none thought they could. The debate among officers and politicians mattered little in the face of that truth. For in the end, recognition did not come from reports or politics, but from the ground itself. The battlefields of Milliken's Bend, Fort Wagner, Port Hudson, and countless unnamed skirmishes bore witness, and the earth, indifferent to prejudice, remembered the blood that was spilled upon it. The story of the generals who would not see is a story of blindness, of pride, of men trapped in the prejudices of their age, but it is also a story of inevitability, of a truth too powerful to remain hidden. For whether acknowledged or not, the USCT had become a force the Union could not live without, and in their march, their song, their sacrifice, they forced even the most reluctant commanders to reckon with what they had become, soldiers of the United States, essential to its survival, indispensable to its victory. The Medal of Honor, the highest decoration a soldier could receive, a small piece of metal forged to bear the weight of glory, pinned to the breast of those who had shown the kind of courage that defied imagination. During the Civil War, 25 black soldiers of the United States colored troops were awarded this medal. 25 men whose bravery blazed so brightly it could not be denied, even by a nation still reluctant to see them as equals, and yet their names drift today in shadows, remembered only in fragments, in dusty archives, in lines of old reports that too few have read. Consider Christian Fleetwood. Born free in Baltimore, a man of education and music, but also a man who knew that freedom demanded more than words. At Chaffin's Farm in 1864, he stood with the 4th United States Colored Infantry. The assault was ferocious, the kind of charge that split regiments and tested the marrow of men. The flag bearer was struck down. In that moment, the colors, the soul of the regiment, lay vulnerable, a symbol that could not be allowed to fall. Fleetwood rushed forward, seizing the flag and holding it high, even as bullets tore the air around him. He carried it through the storm, never letting it touch the ground. For this act of devotion, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. His courage was not just in lifting cloth on a pole, it was in lifting the spirit of his comrades, reminding them that no matter the fire, their cause still flew. Or take Powhatan Beatty, born enslaved in Virginia, freed and living in Ohio when the war came. He enlisted in the 5th United States Colored Infantry, and at the Battle of Chaffin's Farm his company was shattered. Officers fell, confusion threatened to scatter them, but Beatty stepped forward steady and unshaken. He rallied his men, reformed their lines, and led them forward with clarity and resolve. His courage was leadership, born not of rank but of necessity, forged in the crucible of survival. For his actions that day, he too received the Medal of Honor. There were others, each with a story that could fill a book, yet now reduced to a name on a list. Sergeant Major Thomas Hawkins, also at Chaffin's Farm, whose valor under fire earned him the medal. Corporal Miles James, grievously wounded in the same battle, his arm shattered, yet refusing to leave the field. With one arm dangling useless, he loaded and fired his weapon, urging his men forward until he collapsed. Even with his body broken, his spirit remained whole, and for that unyielding defiance, he was decorated with the nation's highest honor. At the Battle of Honey Hill, another name rose from obscurity. Sergeant James M.H. King of the 54th Massachusetts. He carried the regimental colors after the bearers before him were struck down, advancing with the flag as the regiment charged again and again into a storm of Confederate fire. His bravery was written into the very fabric of that blood-soaked ground, though history rarely speaks his name. 25 in total. 25 who received the Medal of Honor, though many more deserved it. Men who carried flags, who rallied broken lines, who pressed forward when wounds should have laid them low. Men who proved in the clearest and most unanswerable way that valor knew no color, that courage belonged to all who dared. And yet, after the war, how many Americans could name even one of them? These medals should have been immortal markers, proof etched into the nation's memory, but too often they were tucked into drawers, mentioned in footnotes, ignored in the grand retelling of battles where white officers filled the spotlight. The stories of Fleetwood and Beatty, of Hawkins and James, slipped into silence. Their medals remained, but the honor due them did not echo in the generations that followed. Even the act of awarding was tinged with irony. These men were decorated for gallantry that could not be denied, but they returned from war to a country still unwilling to see them as equals. Medals in their hands, yet segregation in their lives. Honor on paper, but prejudice in practice. The same government that recognized their bravery still turned its back on their dignity. They had earned a nation's respect, but too often met with its indifference. The Battle of Chaffin's Farm itself stands as a monument to their courage. On that September day in Virginia, black troops charged against well-fortified Confederate lines. Nearly a third of them fell, dead or wounded, before the battle ended. The sacrifice was immense, the bravery undeniable. So striking was their courage that even hostile observers admitted it. Confederate soldiers, stunned by the ferocity of the assault, grudgingly acknowledged that the men they once called inferior had fought with extraordinary valor. Out of that day's blood came 14 of the Medals of Honor awarded to black soldiers in the Civil War, 14 in one single battle. And yet, where are their monuments? Where are the parades in their honor, the statues that should stand in city squares, too few and too far between? Instead, their memory lingers quietly, waiting to be rediscovered, to be spoken aloud again. But medals tell only part of the story. For every Fleetwood, every Beatty, there were dozens more who fought with equal bravery, whose names never reached the lists, whose courage was witnessed only by comrades, and whose deeds were swallowed by time. History remembers selectively, but the earth remembers all. The ground of Chaffin's Farm, of Honey Hill, of Petersburg and Newmarket Heights holds the bones of men who deserved as much honor as any medal could bestow. The Medal of Honor was meant to make their names immortal. In truth, it was not the medal that carried immortality, but their actions. A flag raised against the storm. A line rallied in the chaos. A musket fired with one arm shattered. These moments live on, whether or not the world speaks their names. 25 men were recognized, but the recognition was only the beginning of what they deserved. Their medals were not gifts. They were acknowledgments of debts that could never truly be repaid. Debts to men who stepped from bondage, from prejudice, from silence, and carved their claim upon a nation that had doubted them. Today, when we speak their names, Christian Fleetwood, Powhatan Beatty, Miles James, Thomas Hawkins, James M.H. King, we breathe life into memory nearly lost. We remind ourselves that the story of the Civil War was not only blue and gray, not only generals and presidents, but also men who carried the flag when the world conspired to strip it from their hands. Their medals shine still, if only we choose to see them. Not as relics in museums, not as footnotes in archives, but as living testaments. To courage, to sacrifice, to the truth that freedom was never granted freely, but earned again and again in blood and fire. They marched away with muskets in their hands, but behind them, at the doors of cabins and in the fields of cotton, a different army waited. Wives and children, mothers and fathers, watching the men go. The smoke of departure hung heavy, the sound of boots fading into the distance. These families carried burdens of their own, burdens not marked by bayonets and bullets, but by hunger, loneliness, and the constant fear that the men they loved might never return. The home they dreamed of was not a house of stone or timber. It was an idea, fragile and shining, of a place where families could live unbroken, where children would not be sold, where marriages could not be torn apart by the auction block. For every soldier who took up arms, there were faces he carried with him. Faces of wives working long days in fields now emptied of men, of daughters whispering prayers, of sons learning strength too soon. Some families stayed close to the fighting, moving into makeshift camps that formed in the wake of the Union Army. They called them contraband camps, but they were more than that. They were villages of hope, filled with women and children carving new lives from scraps. Here, mothers stitched clothes, cooked meals, taught letters to children who had never before been allowed to learn. Yet even in these fragile havens danger lurked, disease crept through the tents, hunger gnawed, and the fear of raids, of capture, of violence never vanished. Still they endured, because to endure was itself a victory. The women who waited were not idle. Many followed the regiments directly, working as nurses, tending the wounded with hands hardened by years of labor. Others took up the endless work of laundresses, scrubbing uniforms, patching clothes, carrying the weight of survival on their backs. Some became spies, moving through enemy lines with secrets hidden in baskets or beneath headscarves, carrying messages that could tip the balance of battles. And then there was Harriet Tubman. She was no ordinary figure, no ordinary woman. Already a legend, already the Moses of her people, she stepped once more into danger, this time not to guide runaways north, but to lead soldiers south into the heart of enemy territory. In 1863, she stood alongside Union officers in South Carolina, guiding black troops into the swamps and rivers she knew like old friends. The Combahee River Raid was her triumph, a daring strike that freed more than 700 enslaved men, women, and children in one night. Not with whispers, not with footsteps in the dark, but with the thunder of boats, the roar of fire, the certainty of freedom carried on water. Tubman was the first woman in American history to lead an armed expedition, and she did so not for glory, but for the same dream that every soldier carried, a home unbroken, a people free. In the quiet of campfires, soldiers spoke of these families, of wives and children waiting. They wrote letters scratched out in crooked lines, words that carried more weight than any musket ball. Promises whispered onto paper, promises to return, to build, to never again be parted. Some of those letters never reached their homes. Some reached hands that trembled as they unfolded them, read them by candlelight, and prayed the words were not the last. For the children, the war was a season of absence. Fathers gone, sometimes forever. But there was pride too, even in little hearts that could barely understand. Pride in knowing their fathers fought not as slaves but as soldiers, their names etched onto muster rolls, their pay, meager though it was, sent home to feed empty bellies. These children grew up in the shadow of war, yet they also grew up in the first light of freedom. The dream of home stretched beyond the battlefield. It was spoken in the kitchens where women cooked for armies, in the hospitals where they wrapped wounds, in the songs they sang to steady weary spirits. It was present in the stories whispered to children, stories of a future where chains would not rattle, where schools would open, where dignity would not be denied. Freedom was never fought for only with rifles and flags. It was fought in the silent endurance of women who tilled fields alone, who birthed children into uncertain worlds, who carved stability from chaos. It was fought in the courage of those who carried intelligence across enemy lines, who listened in kitchens where Confederate officers spoke too freely, who passed along details that saved lives. It was fought in the resilience of those who rebuilt shattered families after men never returned. The soldiers dreamed of coming back to homes where wives and children waited with open arms. Some did. They returned to laughter, to tears of joy, to families made whole again. But many others did not. For those families, the dream became a memory, a story told over and over, a father's face remembered through a medal, a letter, a scrap of uniform. The home they dreamed of was not always realized, but it was always the heartbeat of the struggle. Even Harriet Tubman, after the war, struggled to receive the recognition she deserved, living much of her life in poverty despite the magnitude of what she had done. Yet she never stopped fighting. For women's rights, for dignity, for the dream that had carried her across rivers and fields in darkness. Her life was itself a testament that freedom was never secured once and for all. It had to be guarded, nurtured, carried forward. So much of the story of the United States colored troops is told in battles, in charges, in medals, but behind every musket was a family, behind every flag a household of hopes. Wives and mothers bore as much weight as soldiers, carrying absence, carrying grief, carrying the fragile flame of a future they might never see. The children grew into that future, inheriting both the pain and the pride of fathers who had dared to fight. The home they dreamed of was never a single cabin or a single hearth. It was the promise of belonging, of freedom stitched into the fabric of daily life. A promise born not only on battlefields, but in kitchens, in camps, in whispers carried across rivers. Freedom was never only fought with bullets, it was fought with endurance, with love, with a vision strong enough to outlast death. And though history often forgets the names of those women, those children, those families, their struggle is written in every step the soldiers took. For without them, without the homes they dreamed of, the fight itself would have been hollow. The men marched with rifles, but it was the thought of home that steadied their aim, that kept them standing when the storm of war threatened to sweep them away. The war ended not with a shout, but with a long sigh. Muskets were stacked, banners furled, drums silenced. Men who had marched through fire now stood in lines to be mustered out, their names called, their service ended with a stroke of ink on a ledger. The United States colored troops, who had fought in every theater of the war, who had stormed fortresses, guarded rivers, carried the flag when others fell, were now told their duty was done. They laid aside rifles that had been both burden and salvation and stepped into a future none could yet see. They left the army wearing uniforms patched and torn, boots worn thin by countless marches, hats frayed by sun and rain. Their pay, when it came at all, was meager, often months late, sometimes cheated away by dishonest officers or corrupt officials. Still, they carried their discharge papers like holy writ, proof that they had been soldiers of the United States, proof that they had earned the right to be free. Those papers were fragile shields against a world eager to deny their service, eager to forget what they had done. They walked home on dusty roads through fields scarred by cannon fire, past towns that looked at them with suspicion or scorn. Some returned to the South, to lands where they had once bent beneath the lash. They returned not as property, but as veterans, men who had worn the uniform of the Union. Yet for many, the welcome was bitter. Neighbors who had been Confederates remembered too well that these men had helped bring down their world. Whispers followed them. Sometimes violence did too. The government had spoken of promises, land for the freedmen, 40 acres and a mule, opportunities to carve a new life from the soil. For the veterans who had bled for the Union, these promises seemed the least a grateful nation could give. But promises have a way of withering when political winds change. The land was rarely given. The mules were never delivered. Instead, men who had fought bravely were forced back into tenant farming, into sharecropping, into systems that chained them not with iron but with debt. They had shed blood for liberty, only to find themselves bound once more, this time by contracts that left them little better than before. And yet, for a brief moment, hope did bloom. The era of Reconstruction dawned with a fierce, bright promise. Freedmen held meetings under the open sky. Schools sprang up where once it had been a crime to teach black children to read. Churches rose from timber and song, places of worship that doubled as centers of community. For the veterans of the USCT, Reconstruction was not only politics, it was the dream they had marched toward, made tangible at last. Some veterans became leaders in this new world. They stood for office, they sat in legislatures, they cast ballots with pride. They wore their service as a badge of honor, demanding that the nation recognize their sacrifice. They walked into polling stations with their discharge papers tucked into pockets, daring anyone to tell them they had no right. For a time, it seemed possible that the dream might hold, that the sacrifice of war might yield the fruits of freedom. But betrayal came swiftly. The same country that had needed their blood now tired of their voices. Reconstruction faltered under the weight of resistance. White supremacist groups rose in the night, cloaked in hoods, armed with hatred. They burned schools, terrorized families, and targeted veterans most of all, because a black man who had worn the Union blue, who had carried a rifle, who had proven himself a soldier, was the most dangerous symbol of all. He was proof that freedom could not be denied, and so he became the first target of those who wished to turn back the clock. The federal government, weary of war and division, began to withdraw its protection. Promises that once glowed with hope turned cold. Soldiers who had fought for a Union reborn watched as their rights eroded, as segregation laws spread like weeds, as the nation that had depended on them in its darkest hour now looked away. They had marched home dreaming of liberty, only to find that freedom was fragile, always at risk of being stolen. Still, they endured. They planted crops, they raised families, they built schools, they carved what space they could from a hostile land. They carried their medals, their papers, their memories of comrades lost, as reminders that they had not imagined their service. They told their children and grandchildren the stories of battles fought, of flags raised, of victories won. They passed down the truth that once, when the nation was in peril, black soldiers had stepped forward and saved it. The long road home was not paved with gratitude. It was paved with struggle, with betrayal, with the weight of a country that had used their courage and then cast aside their needs. Yet even in this, there was resilience. For every broken promise, there was a family that refused to surrender. For every betrayal, there was a memory of comrades who had not died in vain. The United States colored troops returned from war not only as veterans, but as visionaries. They had glimpsed, in the heat of battle, a nation that could be different, where courage and sacrifice mattered more than color. That vision did not vanish, even when Reconstruction crumbled. It lived on in every freedman who opened a school, in every veteran who cast a ballot despite the threats, in every child who heard the stories and understood that freedom was worth the fight. The dream of a home, safe and free, was not easily won. It was not handed down in proclamations or secured by medals alone. It had to be fought for again and again, in courts, in fields, in churches, in streets. The soldiers who returned from the Civil War carried that truth with them, carried it like they once carried their rifles, heavy, but never abandoned. And though the road was long, though it twisted through betrayal and loss, it was never truly empty. It was marked by footsteps of men who had marched through war and would not let the dream die. The long road home was not the end of their journey, but the beginning of another, a journey that stretched beyond their lifetimes, reaching toward the generations yet to come. They lie beneath the grass, row upon row. Marble headstones stand in military cemeteries, but so many of them carry no names, only numbers. Unknown. A word that should never have marked a life, yet, for thousands of black soldiers of the Civil War, it is all the nation left them. They fought, they bled, they died, but their graves speak in silence. The wind moves through the fields of Arlington, through shaded corners of Vicksburg, through quiet plots at Port Hudson, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear the voices that history tried to erase. Statues were raised for generals, men of wealth and command. Towering figures of marble and bronze cast their gaze over courthouse squares, town greens, and city parks. But the privates who marched in patched uniforms, who carried muskets with trembling hands, who advanced across killing fields, they were forgotten in stone. Their sacrifice was not deemed fit for pedestals. No proud equestrian monuments bore their likeness, no gilded inscriptions sang their names. The United States colored troops, who made up a tenth of the Union Army, who changed the tide of war, were left to vanish from the monuments of memory. Instead, memory survived, where stone did not. It lingered in family Bibles, where mothers wrote trembling notes beside birth dates and deaths. It lingered in whispered stories passed down at firesides, where grandfathers told wide-eyed children of a brother who marched with the 54th, or a cousin who never returned from Milliken's Bend. Oral traditions carried what official histories erased. The names lived on in the spaces where monuments could not reach, in songs, in letters kept safe in wooden boxes, in the prayers of widows who never stopped speaking to their lost. There were attempts, small and scattered, to mark the memory. A plaque here, a marker there, sometimes placed decades after the war, sometimes erected only by black communities themselves, who would not let their dead be swallowed by silence. Churches became sanctuaries of remembrance. In sermons and Sunday schools, children were taught that their fathers had fought not just for the Union, but for freedom itself. The world outside may have tried to forget, but within those walls the story remained alive. Imagine walking through a cemetery in Louisiana or in Tennessee. You see the names of officers carved neatly, the rank and regiment proudly displayed. And then, row upon row, you see markers that read only USCT. No name, no hometown, no age. The men reduced to initials, as if individuality itself was too much to grant them. Yet those simple letters still hold weight. They remind us that here lies someone who wore the Union blue, who stood in the line of battle, who offered his life to a country that struggled to accept him. The erasure was not accidental. It was part of a larger forgetting. A national amnesia that chose to elevate reconciliation over truth. After the war, when North and South sought to mend their divisions, the role of black soldiers was inconvenient. To remember them was to remember that slavery had been at the core of the conflict, and that freedom had been bought with their blood. Easier instead to tell stories of brother against brother, of gallant Confederates and noble Union men. Easier to raise statues to generals and leave the colored troops in shadow. Yet families did not forget. A mother who wore black long after mourning was expected. A widow who laid flowers every year on a grave without a name. A child who grew up with only a faint memory of a father in uniform, but who carried that fragment through life. These small acts of remembrance built monuments more enduring than marble. They were not cast in bronze, but in love, and in the refusal to let names be lost. Some soldiers themselves tried to carve their legacy into the world before death could silence them. Letters home written with halting script told children to remember that their fathers had been soldiers. One man wrote, "Tell them I died as a man, not a slave." These words became the monuments denied to them, carved not in stone but in ink, carried through generations. The irony of history is that the men once denied monuments now stand taller in memory than many of the generals who towered above them in bronze. The generals' statues crumble, their reputations questioned, their causes stained. But the soldiers, the privates, the sergeants, the captains who rose from slavery to lead men into battle, they grow in stature as their stories are reclaimed. They were forgotten, but not forever. Today, researchers comb archives, families trace genealogy, communities raise belated memorials. New plaques bear names once lost. Descendants gather at cemeteries to read aloud the stories of men who died more than a century ago. Oral traditions are given voice in documentaries, in books, in classrooms. The silence that covered those graves is breaking. The monuments that never were are finally being built, not always of stone, but of memory, of recognition, of truth. And so the question lingers. What is a monument? Is it stone, raised high for all to see? Or is it memory carried from parent to child, held in the heart until it can no longer be silenced? The black soldiers of the Civil War may not have been given statues, but they were given something more enduring, a legacy that refuses to die, a testament whispered in songs and prayers, in Bibles and letters, in the earth that holds their bones. As we walk through the cemeteries today, as we stand before graves marked only by numbers, we are called to remember what was almost lost. These men were not unknown. They had names, they had faces, they had dreams. They were fathers, sons, brothers. They were soldiers of the United States, and they gave their lives so that freedom might breathe. And in the end, perhaps the truest monument is not built of stone at all. It is built each time we speak their names aloud, each time we tell their stories, each time we refuse to let silence win. The monuments that never were may still stand if we choose to carry them, not in marble but in memory, where they can never be torn down. The war ended, but the story of the soldiers did not. Their muskets were laid aside, their uniforms folded and stored, their names entered into muster rolls, but their courage echoed on. In the quiet years that followed, when battlefields grew over with grass and memory dulled in the minds of many, the men of the United States colored troops carried their service like a fire inside them. They had been tested in the crucible of war, and though the world often turned away from their sacrifice, they refused to let it vanish. Many veterans gathered in halls and churches, forming civic groups, small brotherhoods of remembrance. They met not to boast, but to remind one another that their service mattered, that history might deny them monuments, but it could not strip away what they had done. They wore faded uniforms to parades, pinned medals to jackets, carried flags in trembling hands. They sang the old songs around tables and told stories to children who sat wide-eyed at their feet. These gatherings were more than reunions. They were acts of defiance, living monuments against the tide of forgetting. The fight for recognition did not end when the cannons fell silent. Veterans turned their struggle from the battlefield to the halls of government. They petitioned for pensions, for fair compensation, for acknowledgement that their wounds, their scars, their lost years of labor had earned them support. White veterans received aid more readily, their claims smoothed by sympathy. But black veterans found doors closed, papers lost, bureaucrats unwilling. So they fought again, not with rifles but with signatures, affidavits, and testimony. They traveled miles to courthouses, gathered witnesses to prove what the battlefield itself had already declared, that they had been soldiers of the Union, deserving of the nation's care. The struggle stretched on for decades. Some veterans lived to see pensions finally granted, though often reduced and delayed. Others died waiting, their families left to inherit the bitterness of promises unfulfilled. Yet even in defeat, the petitions left a trail of memory. Records written in careful script, filled with names, regiments, dates of service. These papers became unexpected monuments, archives of courage hidden in dusty drawers, waiting for descendants to rediscover them. Generations later, grandchildren and great-grandchildren opened trunks in attics, leafed through faded photographs, unfolded discharge papers brittle with age. They found service records that told stories no one had spoken aloud in decades. A family name on a roster, a letter written in cramped handwriting, a pension application describing a wound that never healed. These discoveries stitched together broken lines of memory, restoring to families what history had denied. Each document, each photograph was an echo of courage carried forward into the present. The legacy endured not only in paper but in action. Black veterans returned from war determined to claim their place in American life. They became teachers, ministers, labor leaders, elected officials. Their service gave them authority in communities still struggling under the weight of racism and poverty. When they spoke as men who had marched under fire, as men who had earned the right to demand justice. They inspired others to believe that change was possible, that freedom was not a gift, but a right that had to be claimed and defended. Their courage became a foundation for future struggles. The civil rights movements of the 20th century drew strength from the memory of soldiers who had once stood at Port Hudson and at Fort Wagner at Milliken's Bend. When activists marched in Selma or stood at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, they echoed the footsteps of those who had marched in blue uniforms a century before. The veterans of the USCT had shown that courage could rewrite history, that even in the face of prejudice and violence, the fight for dignity was never in vain. Families kept the stories alive in small ways: a portrait hanging in a hallway, a name recited at family gatherings, a song sung on Sundays carrying verses once hummed around campfires. Some children grew up without knowing the details of their ancestors' service, only that he had been a soldier, that he had fought for something larger than himself. For them, the knowledge was enough, a reminder that their bloodline carried strength, that they descended from men who had shaped the destiny of a nation. Even today, the echoes of their courage continue to ripple outward. Scholars and genealogists uncover forgotten names, placing them back into the story of the war. Communities hold ceremonies to honor men once dismissed as contraband or colored troops. Descendants gather at cemeteries to lay wreaths and read aloud the names of the fallen. In these moments, the forgotten are remembered, the silenced are given voice. The soldiers who once lay beneath headstones marked only with numbers are restored as fathers, sons, and heroes. Their legacy is not just military, it is deeply human. They remind us that courage is not measured only by medals or monuments, but by the quiet persistence to be seen, to be remembered, to claim a place in a story that tried to erase them. They remind us that freedom is never final, that each generation must renew the struggle, carrying forward the echoes of those who came before. The United States colored troops may not have been granted the monuments they deserved in their lifetimes, but their courage was never truly buried. It lived in every petition signed, every Bible entry written, every song sung in the night. It lived in the descendants who still search for their names, who still feel the weight of their sacrifice, who still speak their stories into the air. The war is long over, but the echoes remain. They move through cemeteries and archives, through family homes and public squares. They remind us that history is not only written in marble, but in memory carried forward, in courage that refuses to fade. The soldiers who once marched in blue uniforms still march today, in the voices of those who remember, in the hearts of those who refuse to forget, in the living legacy of a people who carved freedom from the fires of war. Hello, my friend. If you are hearing these words, you have walked with me through a long journey, from the silent fields before the storm, to the burning forts, to the quiet cemeteries where nameless stones mark the lives of men who once dreamed of freedom. You have heard the whispers of forgotten soldiers, the United States colored troops, men who stepped out of bondage and into uniforms, who carried rifles not only for a union, but for a future. Their story is not just theirs, it is the story of America itself. For what is America, if not courage in the face of denial? These men lived in a country that did not want to see them as men. They were called property, treated as shadows, told they had no place in the story of the Republic. And yet when the nation trembled on the edge of ruin, they stepped forward. They fought not only against an enemy in gray, but against the very lie that they did not belong. Their courage was not borrowed. It was not granted. It rose from the deepest well of the human spirit, and it could not be denied. And what is America, if not loyalty met with betrayal? The soldiers of the colored troops pledged themselves to a flag that had so often ignored them. They shed blood for a union that sometimes spat at them in the streets, that paid them less and that doubted their worth even as they marched into battle. They returned from war to find promises broken, reconstruction betrayed, rights stripped away by violence and law, and yet still they remained loyal. Loyal not to the failures of men, but to the vision of what America could be. Their loyalty, tested by fire and disappointment, shines brighter than all the betrayals combined. And what is America, if not sacrifice shaping the nation? The United States colored troops made up nearly 200,000 strong. They filled trenches, guarded forts, carried flags, and charged against impossible odds. They fell on battlefields far from home, in swamps, in rivers, in cotton fields turned red with war. Their sacrifice changed the course of history. Without them, the Union may not have endured. Without them, freedom might not have come when it did. Their blood watered the fragile soil of liberty, and from it, a new America struggled to grow. For too long, their story was buried. For too long, the monuments went to others, the songs sung for others, the textbooks written without their names. But history has a way of waking. Memory has a way of returning. The banner they carried, sometimes in tatters, sometimes drenched in blood, still waves. It waves not only in the wind above cemeteries or parades, it waves in the voices of descendants who speak their names aloud. It waves in the classrooms where their stories are finally taught. It waves in every act of courage, every demand for justice, every reminder that America's promise belongs to all who live beneath its sky. Their story is not simply of war. It is a lullaby of history, sung soft and low, meant to remind us as we drift into thought that freedom was never free, that liberty was never effortless, that equality was never inevitable. It had to be fought for, and it had to be won, by men and women willing to give everything even when the world refused to see them. Tonight, as you listen, picture the campfires glowing in the darkness. Picture the hymns rising into the night air, sung by weary voices with hope still unbroken. Picture the flags carried into smoke and fire, held steady by hands that trembled but never let go. Picture the graves marked with numbers, yet whispering names that will not be silenced. Picture the children of those soldiers and their children's children, walking still beneath the shadow and the light of their sacrifice. The banner still waves. It waves for Christian Fleetwood, who seized the colors when others fell. It waves for Sergeant Carney, who would not let the flag touch the ground at Fort Wagner. It waves for André Caillou, who died leading his men with fearless pride. It waves for the countless unnamed, who lie in soil far from home, but whose courage is carved into the heart of a nation. It waves for every soldier who carried more than a rifle, who carried the weight of proving their very humanity. And so we end where we began, with silence and with whispers, with fields that remember long after men are gone. The United States colored troops may have been forgotten for a time, but they are forgotten no longer. Their story belongs not only to history, but to us. It belongs to every voice willing to carry it forward. It belongs to you now, listening, remembering, holding their courage in your own heart. The banner still waves, and because it does, so too does the memory of the men who carried it into the fire and never let it fall.